I'd like to welcome everyone who's watching online, as well as the group in this room. Thanks again for participating. And again, just a reminder for those folks who are online, we really would like you to be part of this discussion today. So if there's a question that you have, there's a comment, please submit that. And if we don't answer it during after a talk, there is a designated time this afternoon for open discussion. So we would encourage you to participate during one of those periods. But again, all the talks are online, and also I'd like to remind folks that this is being recorded, so if you don't have the opportunity to view it live, it will be available later for viewing when it's convenient. I think yesterday we really had a good introduction to this issue. Several of the talks we heard covered a lot of different categories related to insects and sorry, not insects, but pests and climate. Just to kind of summarize a little bit, what we heard, and obviously there's some variation on this, but we heard about modeling and really kind of where things are at with that from the climate folks, and then we had some really specific talks on things related to agriculture, agricultural modeling, talking about the effects of these conditions on insects and where they're moving. We had a really nice example. Well, I don't know if it's nice, but it was good to hear about an example from the southern pine beetle and the issues that are going on there, and Matt really talked a lot about how that's changing and some of the dynamics there. And then we also heard about the issues related to diseases and some of the things with vectors overseas, internationally, and some of the work that Ken talked about and how mosquitoes and other vectors are being influenced by climate and some of the things that they're doing and how they're responding to that. And then we heard from Changgang about his work on in the southwest region with the including insect population dynamics into their modeling efforts and some of the things that go along with that. So I think there was a really nice kind of diverse group of presentations, and today I think we're going to have some similar types of talks. And again, this is very much discussion oriented, so as much as folks can include that in their presentations, we're going to go for that. And so I just want to remind those people that are online, this is a forum that is trying to address an issue that is kind of up and coming, or it's in a lot of people's minds, it's already present. And so how are these two disciplines, even the climate science and the pest science, working together or collaborating? And how can this forum facilitate that kind of interaction? And then think strategically about what are some plans, what are some ways to address it going forward? Where are the areas that we need to focus on and some things that we can work on together. So kind of with that in mind, I'm going to go ahead and get us started. We're going to hear from several individuals this morning. That we have a morning session, and we're going to hear about the topic of climate change and weeds and disease pests. And some of the topics are related to distribution patterns, models, extreme weather events, and even policy. So I think it's going to be another interesting group of presentations and discussion. And so I'm going to turn it over to Jim Stack from Kansas State University. And he's going to talk about some of the work that he's been doing and related to this topic. So Jim, go ahead.
Well, thank you. Do I need this to worry about this or not?
It's got to be near you. So.
Okay. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay, so based on yesterday's discussions, I went back to my room last night and kind of totally changed what I was going to do. So I was going to talk about emergence attribution and policy, because that's one of the things we do in my lab is we study the emergence of new pests, their impacts, how they're spreading. And right now we're looking at a couple that have human health implications in addition to plant health implications. Having said that, I decided to focus almost exclusively on policy this morning to get the conversation going, mainly because we're all concerned with plant health, and there's a confluence of many issues coming together bearing on plant health that affect this issue of climate change. So it's kind of all these interactive factors that are going on. So that's what I'm going to try to accomplish here this morning. Historically, there should be 20 to 30 species of flowering plants in the UK on January 1st. In 2015, there were 368 species flowering on January 1st. There was a paper in Nature in 2013 that said plants are flowering 10 to 12 days sooner at several locations around the world. Most of us have seen maps like this. The recent one is 1/2 zone warmer than previously. So our plant hardiness zones are changing in the US. Models predict that extreme heat will occur every 1 to 3 years in the US. It could be devastating for heat-sensitive crops like wheat and corn. Having said that, in Kansas this year, we're anticipating record yields of most of our row crops. The permafrost is melting in Russia, and seeds that have been frozen for 30,000 years germinated and flowered, according to a publication in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2012. Personal communication from a scientist in Russia said that there were plant pathogenic bacteria in some of those plants that have been frozen for 30,000 years. It's quite likely that today's plant genotypes would be naive to those pathogens. Host range expansion as a result of climate change may stimulate the evolution of pathogens with enhanced dispersal capabilities, according to a publication in Ecology. Climate change models predict India will be seriously affected. Very productive wheat area in northern India will be drastically reduced. And a scientist that visited us not long ago indicated that their models are saying that losses to plant diseases and pests are predicted to triple by 2050, at least the models they're using in India. Now, this is a region of concern with our Department of Defense. India is currently the second most populous nation on the planet. It's projected to become the most populated nation on the planet sometime between 2025 and 2035. In 2013, it was just barely food secure, and wheat was an important contributor to food security. The climate change projections. Bangladesh will lose more land as a consequence of sea level rise, and India will become too hot for wheat. So what usually happens under these circumstances? People migrate. We're anticipating migrations of people from Bangladesh into India, India into Pakistan, Pakistan into India. And the big deal from our Department of Defense perspective is that this is a nuclear neighborhood. Another region of concern is Africa. Several nations are buying land in Africa to produce food for export. So one of the most food insecure regions of the world is a target of investment to keep in agriculture, but to move food out of Africa. Several investment firms are buying water resources globally. The scale of foreign land acquisitions dwarfs the level of official development assistance. According to the United Nations, the estimate is there's 5 to 10 times higher investment in the ag land and water rights than there is in actual assistance for the local populations. There is a food-water nexus. The South Center said oil conflicts were central to the 20th century history. The struggle over fresh water will be a new turning point in the world order. Half the world's population will be living in areas of high water stress by 2030. Over 1 billion people will remain hungry. The food security, national security nexus. Hunger is tied to civil unrest. When people get hungry enough, they move, and populations on the move are prone to conflict. Remember 2008, where we had food protests and riots in over 30 nations, resulting in the overthrow of at least 2 governments. That played out across the planet: Haiti, Pakistan, Kenya, Argentina. The same scenario played out again towards the end of 2010 into 2011, and people who are paying attention to this believe this will happen regularly over the next 50 years until we get this sorted out. A publication from the National Academies, Climate Change and Tipping Points, a few years ago said the history of climate on the planet, as found in tree rings, ocean sediments, and ice cores, is punctuated with large changes that occurred rapidly, decades to as little as a few years. The current rate of carbon emissions is changing the climate system at an accelerating pace, making the chances of crossing tipping points all the more likely. Abrupt changes in ecosystems, weather and climate extremes, and groundwater supplies critical for agriculture now seem more likely, more severe, and more imminent. Multiple other stressors are pushing natural and human systems towards their limits and thus become more sensitive to small perturbations that can trigger large responses. The United Nations Council on Trade and Development issued a position paper not long ago, Wake Up Before It's Too Late. They said 2 global environmental limits have been crossed, were caused by agriculture, nitrogen contamination of soils and waters, and biodiversity loss. Agricultural greenhouse gas emissions are the second biggest source of global warming in the southern hemisphere, transportation being number 1. But the hitch, of course, is that agriculture and transportation are linked inextricably. We export and import agricultural products globally. So their conclusion, wake up before it's too late, make agriculture truly sustainable now for food security in a changing climate. This is an organization primarily concerned with commerce. Concerns that we have, as evidenced by yesterday's excellent presentations, the geographic redistributions of pathogens and pests, emergence of new pathogens and pests, and increased incidence and severity of disease. These are the same concerns for both climate change and biosecurity. And one of the things that I'd like to suggest is that that amount of background noise is problematic when dealing with attribution. So the 21st century challenges that we face: water, food, energy, public health, climate change, biodiversity. Plant systems contribute to both the problems and the solutions for each one of these. What fossil fuels were to the 20th century, food and water are becoming for the 21st century. Plant health is prerequisite to public health and human well-being, and plant health is undervalued and at increased risk. According to the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, 17% of plant systems are critically endangered, 19% endangered, 38% vulnerable, and just 30% at low risk for a major perturbation. So over 2/3 of the plant systems that underpin human health and well-being are threatened or endangered. Food security from plants. There are at least 350,000 plant species described or predicted. 30,000 plant species are edible, 7,000 plant species used for food, and about 120 plant species are currently cultivated. Having said that, just 5 plant species provide 63% of the calories consumed by humans. 11 plant species provide 93% of the calories consumed by humans. It's the same 11 plant species that humans have been eating for 10,000 years. So the notion that in the next 30 years we're going to find new plant species, develop them, bring them into cultivation to solve our food needs is not rational. Plant health is essential to food security. We eat plants and we feed plants to the animals that we eat. When we look at a public health system, the building blocks are water, food, medicine, science, infrastructure, and policy, and of course all the interconnections. But the 2 foundation blocks are water and food. Water is the basis of sanitation, which is the basis of public health, and food the basis of nutrition, which again is the basis of good health. Food security is not about keeping people alive. It's about keeping people healthy. It's not about providing some minimum number of kilocalories per capita per day. It's about providing safe, nutritionally balanced, and culturally relevant food to everyone. So the question is, can we? Can we provide safe, nutritionally balanced, culturally relevant food for everyone? Well, on Halloween in 2011, the world celebrated. We had reached 7 billion people, different countries taking credit for giving rise to that birth. But at that time, 2 billion people lived in poverty, 1 billion people were food insecure, and 100 million people were at risk of starvation. In the 1980s, we had about 15 food emergencies per year, but in the previous decade, that average went up to 30 food emergencies per year. And not just in Africa and Asia, those food emergencies were distributed globally. In 2010, according to the World Food Program, 93 million people in 70 countries required food aid for survival. So how are we doing with 7 billion people? For the past 25 years, we've been unable to meet the minimum basic food needs for 25% of the world's population. Every year, we add 65 million more people to our planet. It's the equivalent of about 9 more New York cities each year. We are projected to hit 8 billion by 2025 and 9 billion by 2043. Various population models around that figure, 2043, 2050. Most of these models are very good. Their track record's excellent for predicting. Bottom line is we will hit 9 billion in less than 30 years and probably 10 billion by the end of the century. That's a 28% increase in the population over the next 30 years. The population challenge is not just a numbers problem, it's a demographics problem. Increasing urbanization, inverted age structures, and migrations all contribute to this issue. So in 2000, 189 nations signed on to a UN declaration called the Millennium Development Goals to eradicate extreme poverty, alleviate extreme hunger, improve public health and nutrition, and ensure environmental sustainability. When people are hungry, they become malnourished, they earn less, and they drop into poverty. Those in poverty cannot afford enough food, and the right kinds of food become further malnourished, and the cycle continues. So we need to alleviate poverty in order to eradicate hunger, but we need to eradicate hunger in order to alleviate poverty. And this is a conundrum that is extremely difficult to break into in many countries. Food security is about the availability of food and the ability to access food. So what do we do? Well, there's a lot of agreement among government organizations and non-governmental organizations that food security will be achieved through trade, aid, and intensification. However, there's little agreement across the scientific community. Many conflicting perspectives with respect to intensification, GMOs, et cetera, et cetera. Plus, we have moving targets. Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations said we needed to increase food production by 100%, by 110%, by 90%, by 70%, by 60%. It is a moving target. Our estimates are that really it's about 24% to 43%, depending upon certain assumptions you make with respect to food loss and meat consumption. There is no new land or water to develop, so we have to make more use of what we have. That is the only way we're going to feed everyone, according to the International Water Management Institute. In 2013, let's use 2013 figures by FAO, we need to increase food production by 70% over the next 25 years. 90% of that increase will come from intensification of production systems. So what we already have under cultivation, we need to get a lot more out of. Many nations will remain unable to achieve food self-sufficiency. So let's just look at this first one, 90% from further intensification. What does intensification mean? It means genetically uniform high-yielding varieties, which while increasing productivity also increases vulnerability with respect to introduced organisms. More efficient fertilizers and pesticides with all the attendant public health implications. Improved irrigation systems, again, with not only the benefits to productivity, also the negative aspects with respect to public health from local populations. I don't have time to go into a lot of these, but for example, in a lot of these areas where we've introduced irrigation, we've seen a spike in malaria because of the mosquitoes that do quite well in these irrigated systems. 70% of the Earth's fresh water goes to agriculture at present. Intensification of agricultural production is an important solution to the food security challenge, according to many food security agencies. However, intensified agricultural production systems are the single biggest threat to the environment, according to the ecological community. We need to get these people in the same room at the same time. So what about those countries that are unable to achieve food self-sufficiency? How do we deal with that? Well, we must open up global markets, boost global trade, and make reforms that help the poorest. Those reforms oftentimes result in a lowering of the standards for phytosanitary measures. Trade restrictions must be avoided, especially at times of scarcity. Food security through trade and aid, which almost always means pathogens and pests. And again, I don't have the time to go into the specifics. There is a long list of pests and pathogens introduced into developing countries with food aid. Evolution of new species. Now, this is something we've discussed as a concern with respect to climate change. This is already happening. Plant trade has resulted in the evolution of new plant pathogen species with novel host range and virulence patterns that could not have been predicted from the parental phenotypes, according to Clive Fraser and several others at this point. So what does that mean? So we have a species in one environment, we have a species in another environment on a different continent. The end result of global trade is that the geographic boundaries that once kept organisms confined to certain locations have become irrelevant. We put plants on ships and transport them across oceans. We put plants on airplanes and fly them over mountains. So those barriers are gone, and we're seeing plants in contact with each other that never would have happened naturally. And the end result is the evolution of hybrid species. Yes, hybrid species. Normally we would have predicted that these two organisms would not interact. Phytophthora cambivora species A is not a pathogen of alder trees. Phytophthora fragaria is actually a strawberry pathogen, not pathogen in alder trees. The hybrid that resulted from those two species is an aggressive pathogen of alder trees. That hybrid species had a unique phenotype. Host range of hybrid species not predicted by the host range of the parent type. The consequence of this is when we do our pest risk assessments to support trade, it's based on the phenotypes of the organisms in their native range. What this is suggesting is that process is not adequate. Evolution of new species is not just the Phytophthora. We've seen it in viruses. We've seen it in many organisms. Two grass-adapted May streak virus isolates recombined to produce a new wide host range strain that could infect a greater variety of other plants than its parents. Chance recombination could be the reason it has become such a serious problem in Africa. So where does our food come from? Well, it comes from the grocery store. But the more important question is, where does the grocery store get that food? And if we just look at the labels in our grocery stores, Honduras, Mexico, South Africa, Australia, Argentina, our food comes from all over the world. It's not from the areas that are obvious. This is a shot of the Negev Desert in Israel. And for those of you that have visited there, you know this is a region that gets about an inch of rain a year. And yet it's a major production area for produce, mostly for export. And again, mostly for Europe. So when we look at some of these issues driven by population, we're predicting that we need to increase food production by, say, 55 or 70%. We don't really know what that number is, but we're working on these estimates. We also, according to the Millennium Development Goals, not only do we want to feed these people, we want to raise their standard of living and improve their public health. Almost without exception, when you raise the standard of living of a population, it results in a tremendous increase in energy consumption. And then water. There will be enormous competition for water. So there's a food, water, energy nexus. And if we're going to achieve food security through trade and aid, we need to keep one thing in mind, that it takes energy to move food. And when you move food, you move water. Even our grains that are dried down before they're shipped are about 10% water. So when you're talking about millions of metric tons, you're moving water from one location to another. And when you talk about produce, we're talking about 50 to 80% is water. Tomatoes are 85% water. So when you ship them from a production area to another area, you're taking water out of the production area and you're moving it to a new location. Trade is not new. We've been doing global trade for millennia. But what is new is the magnitude of trade and the speed with which we move people and products around the world. In less than 72 hours, I can get from Manhattan, Kansas to almost anywhere in the world, and from anywhere in the world back to Manhattan. 72 hours is less than the incubation period for most diseases. This is a screen capture of a radar shot. Each one of those icons is an actual airplane in flight at 8 p.m. on February 11, 2014. So every one of those icons is an actual airplane in flight at that moment. Go to flightradar24.com. It's a great website. You can click on that icon. It'll tell you what kind of an aircraft it is, where it came from, where it's going to. It's not just the United States. This is global. We're moving a lot of people and a lot of stuff all over the planet. Every day, there are about 6 million cargo containers on ships on the oceans and seas across the world, and every year, 10,000 of those cargo containers fall off the ships. Many of them wash up on shores and spill their contents. Trade pathways. Paper in Nature, 2014. Economic islands, not geographic islands, determine biodiversity now. Cargo ships disperse organisms. More trade, more organisms. Economic isolation may be the only way to protect certain species. Chances of that are not very good. The risks from aid are higher than the risks from trade. Moving a cargo container contains a sample of organisms at each location, according to Charles Perrings, an economist in Arizona who's dedicated his career to the impacts from invasive species. One thing I would recommend for this group is to add an economist. FAO said plant protection systems are failing. The reasons: failure of detection techniques, insufficient area monitored, inspection fails because of large volume. If you ever get a chance to visit a port of entry, do it. It's staggering what comes in and out of this country on a daily basis. Pest and disease is in a cryptic stage at the time of entry or is difficult to identify. From several nations on different continents, we harvest, inspect, pack, ship to the US, then inspect and ship to retail centers in 48 to 72 hours. That is much less than the latent period for most of the organisms that we are concerned with. And that includes human pathogens, plant pathogens, animal pathogens. Symptom-based inspection and interception protocols will miss many of the bad pathogens and pests, and we already know that. Yet, symptom-based inspection is what we're relying on. I will add right here, there's been a change in strategy adopted by several countries, including the United States more recently. We used to randomly inspect what came through our ports. 747 landing in Miami would have 15 different plant species and tens of thousands a unit per plant species. They would look at the bill of lading and say, well, we've got these 15 species, we've got this many units, let's pull these boxes and see what's in them. And doing that, they've intercepted tens of thousands of organisms. But they've decided not to do that. They're going to risk-based. So they're not inspecting things from every country. They're saying, well, we know this organism's over there and we don't want it, so let's focus our efforts on that. It sounds rational, except for what we're no longer looking at. This is just Plant Disease is a journal in our discipline, and they publish each month new reports. So this is from 1 month. 6 reports, these are phytoplasmas. 6 reports, 5 plant host species from 6 countries on 5 continents. Diseases caused by fungi. 25 reports, 25 plant host species from 15 countries on 4 continents. Diseases caused by viruses. 15 reports, 13 plant host species, 5 countries, 4 continents. 46 first reports from at least 15 countries on 5 continents, and this is just 1 month, and every month is similar. We're moving a lot of stuff around. Phytosanitary policy is based on names and areas of freedom. Technology is improving our ability to detect and changing the way we name. This is a problem for us in the future. The technologies we're using now allow us to detect organisms at levels never before possible. So the question's going to become, is it really a new phenomena that we're moving this organism from point A to point B, or is it just that we can now detect it? And that will impact our risk models once we know how to interpret that. The rate of evolution of science and technology has far outpaced the evolution of policy. That's problematic. Food security. Plant biosecurity is essential to food security, no doubt. The strategy for food security is trade and aid. However, trade and aid undermine plant biosecurity. How does this make any sense? The solution is the problem. Should we stop trade? No. We must conduct trade and provide aid responsibly, though. If the solution to food insecurity is increased trade, we need to invest in the plant biosecurity infrastructure before bringing those nations into the global economy. Developing nations that have the poorest infrastructure are trading at about 30% higher than the developed nations that have the best infrastructure. So not only are they putting less clean material in the global marketplace, they're also at increased vulnerability for what they're importing because they don't have the infrastructure to catch things early. So when we go back to our Millennium Development Goals to eradicate poverty, alleviate hunger, improve public health, and ensure sustainability, we want to decrease hunger, decrease poverty, and increase standards of living. As population increases, the demand for food and water will increase, the cost of food and water will increase, and the pressure on plant systems will increase. As standards of living increase, demands for water and energy will increase substantially. And that increase in energy is going to exacerbate many of the concerns we have with climate change. Costs for water and energy will increase, and the pressure on plant systems will continue to increase. Is this strategy sustainable? UN ecosystem assessment said 1/3 of the world's plant systems are endangered, 1/3 of the systems threatened. And according to that concept of a safe operating space, we have already exceeded the safe operating space in 3 of the 7 parameters identified. If we want to be successful, we need to make good decisions. And in order to make good decisions, we need information. Oftentimes, what controls the flow from information gathering to a successful outcome is experience. We are rich in experience of hunger in the world. We learn in our plant pathology courses about the epidemics and famines caused by plant pathogens, such as the Irish potato famine in 1845, 1849, 47, where 1 million died and at least 1 million emigrated. 100 years later, the Bengal rice famine, where almost 3 million people died of hunger and hunger-related illnesses. So we're rich in experience, but how successfully do we use that experience? That's often determined by policy. And because policy provides the framework for decision-making. Policy often generates unintended consequences. Go back to the Irish potato famine. During the potato famine, Ireland was producing abundant cereals, eggs, meat, and fish, all for export markets. While people were literally starving to death in the street, food was being exported out of Ireland. 100 years later, while people were literally starving to death in Bengal, food imports were restricted because of the war effort. We need informed policy. In 2000 to 2001 in Nebraska, there was a severe drought. 0 inches of rainfall in many counties from September of 2000 to June of 2001. 0 rain. That's a big deal in areas that don't get a lot of rain. Conservation Reserve Program was designed to keep land out of cultivation for a certain number of years. However, because of policy, farmers and ranchers were ripping up land that was in conservation reserve and planting corn in a drought. Why were they doing that? Because it was more profitable to lose money growing corn than to keep land in the conservation reserve program. If we look at that ecosystem assessment, intensification of agricultural production systems is an important solution to food security challenge. However, intensified agricultural production systems are the single biggest threat to the environment, according to ecological community. Agricultural production systems are a major cause of biodiversity loss. Restoration ecologists propose establishing global plant rescue sites. So what we want to do is, much like we do in pest risk assessment, we want to do climate matching. And we'll look around the world and say, here's an area where this plant community would do well. So it's under threat here, so let's move the community there. Consequence of that, of course, is that we'll be introducing exotic plant species and communities into new environments to preserve diversity at the cost of redistributing pathogens and pests, without a doubt. We need informed and balanced policy. So the good news with respect to hunger is that as we invest in agricultural research, the cost of food goes down, poverty and hunger go down. The bad news is that as poverty and hunger goes down, our investment in agricultural research goes down, the cost of food goes up, and poverty and hunger go up. So we need to sustain poverty and hunger in order to maintain the investment in the agricultural research necessary to reduce poverty and hunger. How does that make any sense? Perhaps the most significant outcome from this group would be recommendations for a policy framework and a research agenda to address climate change and plant health. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. That's great. Before I ask a question, maybe Lou wants to ask something.
Wow, that was an exceptional presentation. Thank you so much. Do you have any advice at all on how to translate this information to the research arms of the federal government, particularly Agriculture Research Service, which has seen a consistent drop in its research funding for almost everything, but particularly for climate change research? Is there some means to impart the significance of all of this in a way that policymakers can understand it? I mean, maybe color charts or simple one-syllable words. How do we do this?
Well, so I have thought about that a little bit. I think it's about messaging, and we need to communicate differently outside of this room than we do inside this room. So with respect to climate change, this is my personal opinion, I think our messaging was appropriate for people in this room, but maybe not necessarily for those that don't really grasp the nuances. So for example, when you say the global temperature, the mean temperature, might go up 2 to 4 degrees this century. I'm from Kansas. It goes up 50 degrees in a day. It doesn't resonate. I think we need to focus on the so what. Why should you care? This is why you should care. Don't worry about the details that we're concerned with the 2 to 4 degree. You say, look, if we don't get a grip on how we do business, these are the potential outcomes with a fairly high level of confidence, and we know that because this is already happening. These are the indicators that this is already happening. So instead of trying to win them over with the science, I think we say, because of the science, this is why you should care. The defense community is really starting to get on board with this. They understand the implications. If you look at the Arab Spring, there were many underlying cultural, social, and political problems. But the proverbial last straw was the increase in price of food. That is what sent that vendor to the streets in Tunisia, and then the repercussions from there on. And we've seen that in Madagascar, we've seen that in Argentina, we've seen that in several places, that it's the price of food. Well, there's no scenario I've seen, credible scenario, that doesn't indicate we're going to see an increase in the price of food. And it's not just the cost, the dollar, it's what proportion of your income does that represent. So if we look at, and this is not just a problem for developing countries, it's a problem for the United States. Currently, we have 45 million people on food assistance in the United States. The lowest 20% of income earners in the United States spends 37% of their income on food. So if we look at the cost of food going up, major impacts. So I think you hit on the so what, and not the details going into the so what.
One of the issues with this too, and you sort of briefly alluded to it, is related to energy. And when you see the change in the Arab Spring and the food crises in 2008, that's when oil prices peaked from 2008 through 2013. Yeah. We're sort of in what I would call a my pretty pony time right now, because the prices have dropped by half. But that is, from all indications, of course, not going to be a permanent fixture going forward. Energy prices are going to be volatile, and as a consequence of that, food prices will be also. So that's another issue into the mix. So anyway, thank you very much.
Yeah, I had actually, Mike, go ahead. Go ahead.
Mike Hoffman, I have both a suggestion and a question. The first is do a TED Talk on this topic. Compress it to 10 minutes. Second question, how do you currently in your position affect policy? How are you conveying this? I don't know what you do, so I'm just trying to understand, how do you get this message into the policy world?
Yeah, my boss asked the same question. What you do. I think it's really important for scientists to interact directly with policymakers. You can do that in a number of ways. For those of you that are at universities, every university has a legislative liaison. Connect with that person. When the legislators in your state come to visit your university, which they all do, get on the agenda. I do. I've been on the agenda for years. Occasionally, I come to Washington and sit down with different groups. When you can get those opportunities, do that. So, for example, congressional staffers or with your specific representatives. Give them, your 10-minute spiel. I mean, the thing we have to remember is when you think about value in living systems, humans are at the top, animals second, and plants are a distant third if they're even considered, because we don't intuitively ascribe value to plants except maybe the people in this room. So they're just plants. A way I describe it often is that if you saw in your morning headline, millions die from epidemic, if the topic was humans, you'd be alarmed. If it was animals, you'd be concerned. But if it's plants, it's kind of curious. It just doesn't evoke the same. We don't have the same level of response to plant systems. So we're going to have to provide that. We're going to have to tell people why they should care about plant health, that it impacts their health and it impacts their pocketbook, both of them.
Yeah, and I had a add on to that. I think basically we're talking about a nation, countries changing course in policy, and where it's not as relevant now, advocating from a scientific standpoint that yes, these things are happening. But I think also another thing is look at countries. I mean, you brought the example of unrest and people migrating for reasons related to food security. Those individuals have gone through it. They have experienced it, and that seems to be part of the group that needs to be talking to countries that haven't experienced it to say, look, this is real, this will happen, because that's part of this kind of convincing people that this change is real. And I think if there's a way to capture that, we see it on the news, and it still seems kind of distant. So it's like, how do you make that a real part of this discussion as well? And that's part of this, I think, to bring that into this whole area.
There are no shortage of examples. I completely agree. No shortage of examples. We just saw Bangladesh is a country working very hard to achieve food security. Rice, their number one commodity, wheat, second. And they couldn't produce enough wheat, so they import. Their primary supplier was the Ukraine, which is an excellent producer of wheat. But as a consequence of the prolonged drought in Russia that we might ascribe to climate change, as a consequence of that, Ukraine stopped exporting. And so Bangladesh had to go on the global marketplace to get their wheat. The consequence of that was some of that wheat came from South America, where there's an emerging disease, Magnaporthia rhizitriticum, which causes a disease called wheat blast. End result, massive outbreak of wheat blast in Bangladesh earlier this year, all over the country, as a consequence of a change induced by climate change, but they had to change where they get their wheat. So there are lots of examples of this playing out.
Great. Let's do one more question from Jeff Hickey.
Hi, thanks for your talk. I seem to recall that the challenge or the issue is that we have plenty of food, we just can't get it into the hands of the people that need it, maybe due to corruption or inefficiencies in food distribution. Can you comment about that?
Yeah, certainly. So there are lots of different ways to calculate food security. If you do it strictly on a calorie basis, we're producing plenty of calories to feed everybody. But it's not just about calories. It's about the right balance of foods for fats, for protein, and for carbs, and getting that balance right. With respect to that, it's a little bit more challenging, and the calculations aren't as clear whether we're actually producing enough right now. I think I indicated we don't really need to double food production. And doesn't need to be 70%. We think it's more around the 25%, 24 to 30%, depending upon other assumptions. So it's more about getting that diet that keeps people healthy, not just keeps them alive.
Well, thank you, Jim. I appreciate that, and we'll look forward to more interaction on that topic. We're going to move along to our next speaker, who is he's from Columbia with NASA. This is Dr. Ben Cook. So he's going to talk about the work that he's been doing with climate models and some other things. So, Ben, you've got the floor, and we'll listen to you next.
Sorry, is this the... Okay. Okay, well, thank you very much. I'm mostly a climate modeler, and most of the work that I do is trying to understand drought dynamics, and particularly the role that climate change will play in drought. So I'm going to be riffing a little bit off of Keith Dixon's excellent talk yesterday and bringing my own kind of perspective, talking about the mechanisms by which we need to think about drought in the future, and end with some best practices for those of us who want to use these projections to look at drought and drought dynamics. First, though, I want to talk a little bit about why we might care about drought from the perspective of pests. The reason we care is that drought is another one of these stressors on agricultural and natural ecosystems that can make these systems much more susceptible to additional stressors, such as insects or pathogens or even other disturbances. This image on my first slide here is actually a MODIS satellite image from August 2015 of the west coast of the United States. This is a year when severe drought extended pretty much across the entire coast. And it's maybe a little hard to see, but these little white areas right here are all smoke from fires that occurred across the region. And so one consequence, of course, of drought is fire in many of these systems. But drought also can make plants and make ecosystems much more susceptible to things like insects and fungal pathogens. When plants start to experience moisture stress, much of the time they'll close their stomata to preserve water, reduce water losses, but at the same time this also reduces carbon assimilation and productivity. And with lower carbon assimilation, lower productivity, fewer carbon reserves, many of these plants then have kind of fewer defenses against insects and other pathogens. And in fact, in cases of drought mortality, where droughts kill trees or kill plants, it's oftentimes not the drought itself that's directly doing the killing, but it's these other pathogens that come in and attack these weakened trees and these weakened systems. Something that I think others today will talk quite a bit more about. A really good example of this, much of the western United States over the last 15 years has experienced some quite severe and recurrent droughts. The one that, of course, dominates the headlines is California. And there's a recent report that came out this summer that estimated that drought conditions in California have resulted in pine beetle outbreaks across the state that have killed about 66 million trees since about 2010. So really quite substantial mortality. And this picture right here is actually not from California. It's from a pine beetle outbreak in Wyoming, but it gives you a sense for kind of what this landscape starts to look like after these pine beetle infestations. Oops. When we think about drought, though, we need to think a little bit beyond simply the supply side of the equation, because drought is not just precipitation. And in fact, the types of droughts that we actually care about from an impact perspective, whether it's on our water resources for municipal supplies, irrigation water available for agriculture, or the amount of moisture that's being supplied to our ecosystems, we really need to think about other parts of the hydrologic cycle, in particular soil moisture and hydrology. And once we start to care and think about these types of droughts, soil moisture or what are called agricultural droughts, or these hydrological droughts, then it's not just a matter of changes in moisture supply, changes in precipitation. We also need to think about changes in temperature. And the reason we need to think about temperature is because when temperatures increase, the evaporative demand of the atmosphere increases. The amount of moisture that the atmosphere wants to suck out of the surface increases. And all else being equal, that results in increases in evaporation from the surface, increases in transpiration by plants, and with more water going into these fluxes, it means that there's typically less water available for surface runoff to supply our streams and lakes and surface reservoirs, less soil moisture that all the plants are, of course, using, and in many cases also less snow cover, which is really critically important in many ecosystems where much of the growing season moisture supply comes from the the seasonal melt of snow in the spring. And so the case I'm going to make today is that when we start thinking about drought in the future and what that's going to mean, particularly from an impacts perspective, we really need to start incorporating temperature information into this, into these sorts of analyses. So what do the models say? What do the models say are going to, what do they say about climate change and drought into the future? Well, the first thing and the simplest thing that we can kind of look at is precipitation. So this is from a suite of models from the RCP 8.5 kind of high emissions, high warming scenario for the future, looking at changes in precipitation in December through February and June, July, August. And this is kind of averaged across a bunch of different models with kind of robust model agreement in the stippled areas. And what you can see is that if we look at precipitation alone, the picture is very mixed and very cloudy and kind of noisy. You know, some regions look like they're going to get wetter, some regions are going to get drier, but in a lot of areas we don't have very high confidence in the sign or the magnitude of these changes. And this is because precipitation in these models is, in many cases, highly parameterized, and there's many different processes that go into simulations of precipitation. And so things are just going to be much noisier and less certain. If, however, we look at, for example, the top layer soil moisture in these models, we see a very different picture, which is that the most robust responses in the soil moisture, or the soil moisture response, does not really look like the precipitation response. The most robust responses in soil moisture, in fact, are ones of drying. And this drying seems to occur over larger areas than where we see the precipitation changes alone. So, for example, over Western North America, where I spend most of my time working, you can see that these soil moisture changes, these robust soil moisture changes, extend over almost the entire Western United States. Whereas, if you recall from the previous slide, most of the precipitation declines happen in the Mexico and the extreme Southwest. So we might ask, well, why are we seeing this very different picture in the soil moisture? It must mean that something else other than the moisture supply is happening and driving these changes. And the answer is it's temperature. The temperature responses in these models are much more robust. Pretty much every single model says it's going to warm nearly everywhere in nearly every season. Rates are going to differ between models and between locations, but you can see here that pretty much the entire globe here is stippled, indicating really quite robust agreement across models in the sign of the temperature changes. With this warming, we increase the vapor pressure deficit. So this is my own kind of calculation from these models. Vapor pressure deficit is the difference between really how much the atmosphere can hold and how much water is actually in there. The higher the vapor pressure deficit, the greater the evaporative demand, and the more drying you can expect to see at the surface, all else being equal. And what we see is that much like the temperature response, the increase in vapor pressure deficit across the world is also fairly robust. Again, the different areas are going to be different in kind of magnitude, and the models themselves are going to differ a little bit, but pretty much every model shows that over land areas with this warming, we're going to see an increase in vapor pressure deficit and evaporative demand. We can then take this information and then run it through some of our own kind of drought indices and kind of look at the differential, what we might call the different contributions to the drying then from both changes in precipitation and changes in the evaporative demand. This is from a paper that we published a few years ago. So this would just show changes at the end of the 21st century in one particular drought index, the Palmer Drought Severity Index. This is an indicator of soil moisture that's used quite extensively in drought monitoring in the US and across many global or many other areas. If we estimate changes using this index, using output from these models, assuming that the only thing that's changing is precipitation, so isolating that precipitation effect, we get a picture that looks like this. Again, we've kind of stippled in here the most robust regions. And really, it's just, the drying itself is kind of highly localized where the precipitation changes are occurring. Once we add on these temperature impacts and this increase in evaporative demand, we see a picture that looks like this. More intense drying where precipitation is shifting things drier. But also, this warming is actually enough to expand this really robust drying into areas where there's very little precipitation change, really highlighting the importance of this demand, this warming-induced demand that's just sucking more moisture out of the soil and out of these surface reservoirs. A few locations we can see where this evaporation-induced drying is going to be particularly important. So here we've zoomed in and we've averaged over the Central Plains of North America, of course a major agricultural region. And here we're just showing the changes in this drought index with negative values indicating drier, positive values indicating wetter. And here we've actually broken it out for each of those individual models. So if we just look at precipitation over this region, the news actually looks kind of good with most models suggesting an overall increase in precipitation. But then once we take into effect that evaporation-induced drying, we see an overall tendency towards much, much drier conditions. A value of -1 is considered a moderate drought, and these are averages over the last 20 years of the 21st century. Southeast China, the precipitation response is really quite mixed. Okay, some models showing drying, some kind of wetting, but again, once we add on that warming effect and that increase in evapotranspiration, we see a big shift towards drying in nearly every model. Again, still quite a bit of scatter, and this is information that you kind of want to think about because even if models agree on the sign, they don't always agree on the magnitude. And then the final example here is just Europe and the Mediterranean, where here, over much of the Mediterranean, we do see some precipitation declines that are significant. But then once we again add on that effect of increased evaporative demand, we really start to dry things out quite substantially. Now, that was a kind of interesting study that we did, but that's just kind of one drought index that's actually fairly simplified. And it does a very simplified treatment of land surface processes and vegetation processes, and it doesn't include some things that are kind of important, like, for example, CO2 fertilization, which is expected to in many cases, maybe make these plants more drought tolerant and reduce losses, reduce the effect of this evaporation-induced drying. So in a follow-up paper focused on Western North America, we decided to look again at the Palmer Drought Severity Index over Western North America, calculated from these models, but also compared against different soil moisture indicators taken directly from these climate models, from the coupled models that reflect these full two-way interactions and incorporate all these important soil and vegetation processes with varying degrees of complexity. So here's one from those climate models that goes down to about 30 centimeters. I guess the rooting depth of probably most agricultural vegetation, and then a deeper soil moisture down from the surface to about 2 meters. And this is maybe encouraging or not, depending on your perspective. Generally, what we see is that even our simple drought index gives us an answer that's really quite similar to these much more sophisticated coupled treatments of the land surface. Obviously, there's some differences, all right? For example, the soil moisture from the models near the surface doesn't dry out quite as much as the Palmer Drought Severity Index, but the signs are generally the same. And in some cases, the drying in these coupled models themselves is actually quite a bit more severe than our more simple index, for example, in the Southwest down here. Okay. We can take these and we can ask lots of different questions. One particular question that at least I'm really interested in is trying to understand what these droughts in the future look like compared to just natural variability over the last 1,000 years. We know there have been very bad droughts in the past, such as during the medieval era when we had these mega droughts over the Central Plains in the Southwest that persisted for decades. 10, 20, 30, even 40 or 50 years, events that are really far outside of our contemporary experience. And then we can look to the future and we can kind of do some comparisons to ask the question, well, how severe is this drying in the future going to be compared to what things looked like even in the most severe centuries in the past? And this data is taken from tree ring records from the region. So these are all one scenario. These are the different drought indicators averaged across the models. So this is just the kind of multi-model average view. But of course, there's useful information in the spread across these models, and that's what I'm kind of showing here. So in the top we have, here we're looking at the Central Plains. In the top we have our simple palm oil drought severity index indicator, and the bottom here is our 30 centimeter near surface soil moisture indicator taken from the coupled models. And these are actually kernel density functions, probability distributions across all these models for different time periods. So in the shaded area in the background, that's the probability distribution of these different drought indicators from the tree ring record for these really dry centuries in the 1100s and the 1200s, those really bad mega droughts. And so you can see that they're, of course, biased a little bit dry because things were much drier back then. The blue line here is kind of all those model simulations pooled for the historical period, 1850 to 2005, kind of centered around 0. And then the red lines here are from those same models all pooled together, but in this case, looking at the latter half of the 21st century. And so what you can see pretty clearly is there's this shift in the probability distribution towards much drier conditions and a higher likelihood of particularly dry years. Even in this area, like the Central Plains, where the evaporation is, or where the drying is mostly due to changes in evapotranspiration and not so much changes in precipitation. Now that said, it's important to recognize too that there's still some years occurring here on the wet side of the distribution in the future. So even in a future that is droughtier, where things are on average drier, we can still expect wet years. And in some cases, we may even see very extreme wet years. But overall, things are going to shift towards the dry end. We see a similar situation in the Southwest. Here, though, things are getting hit not only by this increase in evaporative demand, but also this is one region where we expect to see these declines in precipitation. So we're kind of drying things out both on the perspective of the supply and the demand side of things. We can run these through some statistical models to ask some questions about drought occurrence. So for example, if we say a mega drought is 35 years or longer, this is a drought event that has not occurred any time in the history of the United States, but we know was fairly common back during the medieval era when things were much drier. What we see is that the likelihood of, if you believe these simulations, then the likelihood of one of these megadroughts occurring at the end of the 21st century, if we follow this kind of high emission scenario, is in excess of 80%. And this is based on kind of pooling of all the information from all of these models, not just a kind of average view of things, but really, what do all those models combine together, and what does the distribution tell us about the likelihood of these multi-decadal droughts happening at the end of the 21st century? So, when we use these climate models to look at drought, there's a couple things that I think we all need to kind of keep in mind, and that's because drought is no one thing. There's lots of different ways that we can look at drought, and depending on the impact or the dynamics that you're interested in, one way is going to be better for you than another. So the first thing you want to do is kind of consider your drought variable. Are you interested in precipitation? Are you interested in snow, soil moisture, runoff, stream flow? All right, because in many cases you're not going to get the same answer for what's going to happen to drought in the future from all these different variables. So it's really important to kind of define things and figure out, what you actually care about. Probably in terms of pests and ecosystems and agriculture, you're probably going to mostly care about soil moisture. And so it's good to kind of pick an indicator that represents that. It's also useful to think about what you actually kind of care about. Right? Do you care about the kind of average aridity, the kind of average state? Or do you care about the recurrence intervals for some of the most extreme droughts? You know, is your system set up to deal with a 1 in 100-year drought that might become a 1 in 50-year drought at the end of the 21st century? Do you care more about drought severity, drought length? Okay. Again, you know, you can analyze these things for all these projections for all these different sorts of indicators, and they'll all give you, in many cases, a different answer. It's really important to embrace uncertainty, okay, in these projections. All right, you can kind of pick any model you want, but you know, the way I kind of like to approach this is to think about incorporating as many relevant indicators as you can, as many models, and really kind of, you know, don't think about just the kind of average model response, but really pooling all that information together to generate these probability distributions that can allow us to kind of think the way I like to do, which is probabilistically. You know, the climate, you know, it's not deterministic. You know, what is it? Well, we can say something about the likelihood based on our understanding of the system of these droughts occurring into the future. So with that, I'll thank everybody and be happy to answer any questions.
Great, thank you, Ben. Any questions that folks have for Ben right now? Yes, go ahead, Mike.
Toby Alt was co-author on one of your papers, is that right?
Yes.
He was inundated by people very much concerned in the Southwest. That prediction, what happened in your world? Were you contacted by businesses and so on, just people really genuinely?
Yeah, I mean, that paper generated a kind of lot of interest, and you know, I've been contacted and working with people at some of the water agencies in California to try to translate some of this information into information that's maybe more actionable from a you know, from a management kind of perspective. You know, really what we tried to do was to try to throw in all the possible uncertainties and see if we could come up with some kind of robust estimate of what climate change is going to look like for drought in the Southwest. And you know, I think it showed that even once you account for all these uncertainties, the kind of convergence of evidence really is towards a drier future if we kind of follow this high warming scenario.
Any question? Yes,
This
Matt.
Jean, oh, sorry.
So,
I'm sorry.
Matt or Jean?
Jean Steiner, you showed one figure where the projection was for a pretty robust increase in the vapor pressure deficit, which would be relevant to some of the pest issues. Are you seeing that in signals, in the climate signals to date?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of a complicated question because in a lot of these regions, you know, there's still a lot of natural kind of background variability that makes it kind of difficult to ascribe whether a trend is just kind of part of some natural variation or whether, you know, we are seeing kind of, you know, a climate change signal there. I think some areas it is starting to emerge. For example, in the southwestern United States, you know, there's what appears to be a pretty robust increase in the vapor pressure deficit. And I didn't have time to go into it, but there have been quite a few studies coming out the last couple of years that are starting to show this important role of temperature in droughts in the upper Colorado River Basin, in the Pacific Northwest, and in other areas that, you know, suggest that these projections are reflecting the physics that are happening now.
Yeah, Walt?
Yeah, some of your models showing temperature and talking about precipitation, one of the things that occurred to me out west is most of our water holding capacity is in the form of snowpack. And with the rise in temperature, what you could actually see is loss of water because of sublimation.
Mm-hmm. No, and in fact, that's what happened last year in the Pacific Northwest with that drought, is that precipitation was actually about average across the Pacific Northwest. But because temperatures were so warm, there was so little snowpack by the time the spring came around that it just led to really severe drought conditions across the region. And you know, those are the types of events that we think are going to be more common with climate change.
Right, but then how does that also get to recharging the groundwater? Because most of agriculture is actually pumping from the groundwater.
Yeah, so currently in these models, you know, they don't do groundwater very well. And there's also kind of complications whether you're kind of putting in something like fossil groundwater or aquifers that recharge over 100-year timescales or 1,000-year timescales. And so there's a lot of work to try to figure out the best way to incorporate that information in these climate models, but it's still pretty uncertain.
So we have a question online from an online participant.
Intrigued by slide showing Labrador switching from wet PDSI to dry in soil moisture. Why would that happen?
Labrador, I guess, in Canada, right? Just if you, all else being equal, if you increase the temperature in the atmosphere, you're just going to suck more moisture out of the soil and just make things on average drier. Once you start to get to those higher latitudes, there's other complications. So, of course, the vegetation is always playing a role. And that's really where our kind of big uncertainties are, I think, in terms of how the vegetation is going to modulate the drying response. But also once you get to those higher latitudes too, you start to need to think about soil freezing and snow cover and some complicated processes that in some cases don't, simple indices like the Palmer Drought Severity Index just don't capture.
Keith, you had a question?
Yeah, it might be related to that one a little bit. It has to do with the communications aspect in a way. Because we talk about separately temperature, precipitation, water vapor, atmospheric quantities. Those are separate and distinct. You then were showing how looking at the global climate models, soil moisture gave you an integrator, although the different land surface models are at different levels of sophistication. So then another third way you did it was through the Palmer Drought Severity Index. However, I was just interested on your views about how that's useful or what the limitations are of that as a communications device, since it has strengths and weaknesses itself, the Palmer Drought Severity Index, in terms of comparing different geographic locations or potentially over time.
Yeah, PDSI is useful because this is what a lot of people who monitor droughts and are kind of, it's one index that a lot of people use to kind of monitor droughts. And so, at least in a lot of the drought community, including people who are working kind of more directly with stakeholders, it's kind of a common indicator. So I think it's useful to kind of, look at that, but I don't think you want to stop there. And I think you want to, acknowledge the fact that, it is simplified. I mean, it does seem to work pretty well for historical droughts, but it is simplified, and so it might miss some of these important processes in the future. And so I think it's important to kind of identify, well, where do we see things in these more complicated models that are congruent with the PDSI, and where do they diverge? And then where they kind of diverge is where we can kind of try to dig in and figure out, what's going on. But I'm of the philosophy that if we're communicating with the public and these stakeholders, we need to be transparent as possible about these uncertainties. And again, this is why I kind of like to talk in probability distributions and things like that instead of deterministically.
Great. Matt, I saw another. Matt, did you want to ask a question?
Yeah, thank you. Drought is the concept is contextual for people and plants in a way. So this year, for example, lots of news and talk in New England. There's a drought, they say. Well, if this were Arizona, it'd be a good year for people and plants. The species of trees that are there. Some trees may die under these conditions. Other trees would be happy, and people. There's an extent of that too. What are our expectations? Does that open the door for some level of adaptation of people and landscapes to changing conditions, or is that just a red herring?
No, I mean, it's a good point, and I guess it didn't make. Whenever I kind of talk to people about this, particularly in the public or outside the field, I always point out that these projections of a much drier Western North America do not mean that things are going to descend into some sort of Mad Max-like post-apocalyptic wasteland. There's lots of water out there, but there's not as much water for us to do everything we've been doing as inefficiently as we've been doing them and expect the same results. And in fact, in responses to the California drought and the ongoing multi-year drought across much of the Southwest, people have really come together and reduced water use and taken the issue seriously to kind of change their behaviors in order to reduce the kind of impacts of these droughts. So there's a really important and a really powerful human component into how these droughts ultimately impact our societies and our agriculture. And yeah, I mean, so I think that's a really good point, that changing behaviors and expectations can go a long way.
Great. Yep, Steve, Frank. Turn your mic.
So is there anybody using this information to come up with ecosystem-specific, basic guidelines that land managers could use, say in a Midwestern cornfield or in a Western pine forest, where if you have, in a given year, a certain higher temperature, so for X degree of temperature increase in a given year, you need this much more precipitation to maintain either yield in corn or to know that your trees are going to be under more stress and perhaps more susceptible. You may need more intense management of a pine forest. It seems like you could develop not you personally, but one could develop some sort of index that would relate these temperature and precipitation to inform plant stress at a, just basic level people could implement.
I agree. So we haven't done much of that, but what we've been doing is trying to make connections with the people who can kind of tell us what we need. I mean, all these indicators that I'm using are good from a hydrology and a climate science perspective to look at this stuff. But, you talk to a water manager in California and they don't care about PDSI. But the ongoing activity we have right now that's probably, I guess, closest to what you're suggesting is, we're working to translate this information to stream flow projections for the San Francisco Public Utilities Commission, because what they care about is stream flow, and that's kind of what they use to kind of allocate and make planning decisions. But I think there's a lot of opportunity to do that, and it's just a matter of getting the right people into the room.
Great. We're going to take one more question, and it's from an online participant.
Impossible question. Do you think agricultural production in Western U.S. is sustainable over the next 50 years, given the change in likely soil moisture conditions, or will production have to shift to other areas?
I think in some capacity, yes, we will. It will be sustainable. It's just going to be a matter of kind of, how much we have to change agricultural practices, how much we're going to continue to share water across state boundaries, and also decisions about kind of what crops we are still viable in the future. Do we still want to grow cotton for the next 100 years in Arizona? But it's hard for me to kind of say, I think there's opportunities there, but it's hard for me to say what the ultimate outcome will be.
Great. Thank you, Ben, for your presentation. So we're going to have a break, but before we do that, we have 2 questions for our previous speakers. So Jim, if you're ready for a couple of questions for your talk. We have some online folks. Go ahead, Nancy.
Well, one's a question and one's a request, and this is a request that I've gotten for some of the speakers of yesterday too. So I'll have to figure out how and if we want to do this. And that is, have gotten requests for some of your emails and for some of your presentations. So if you feel comfortable, they will be able to access them once this whole talk is put online on our center's website. That's kind of a tedious way to do it. So we'll have to figure out if we want to add all your presentations, if you guys are up for that, and that, that will be a discussion for after. The question is, and this is kind of a question, kind of goes back to Lou's. It strikes me that with crop food supplies in the U.S. at high levels, it is hard to convince Congress to raise funds for ARS. The funding will need to be targeted at those uses that will address the problems that you identified: pest detection and response, abiotic stress responses, food policy, climate change, etc. So that's kind of more of a comment than a question, but do you want to respond, or?
I'm searching for the question.
Yeah, it's kind of more of a statement.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure what to do with the statement. I mean, the funding issue is a challenge. I tried to point that out. And the thing we have to keep in mind is that when we are delivering our message, the next person that comes in is going to be talking about healthcare, Social Security, and other very pressing issues. So we have to put our perspectives in a context that shows the importance of this to all of those other issues. And I think that's one of the take-home messages. We can't just look at climate change in isolation of all these other issues that are affecting plant health. It's clearly important, but we have to look at it in the context of all these issues that are coming to bear on plant health. Now, with respect to capacity, the United States Census Bureau projects the population in the United States will increase 82% this century. Just think about that. Population in the United States is going to increase 82% this century. So all this issue about capacity and excess production has to be looked at with that statistic in mind. We are currently adding one new person to the United States every 14 seconds. And that's when you take into account births, deaths, immigration. One new person every 14 seconds. So 82% more people in the U.S. It's going to require a lot of food. It's going to require a lot of services that we derive from plants. So we need to look at climate change, biosecurity, all of these things in the context of plant health and the importance of plant health to human health and well-being.
Yeah, I would follow up on that. Just the context concept. As a director of a center, we obviously are focusing on an aspect of managing pests, but how do you put that in context for the general population or groups that are outside the choir, so to speak, and how do you relate what the importance of that is to what they're interested in? And I think if we can do that, I think that's where we're going to see hopefully some changes. Yes, but great addition.
Yeah, I agree with that completely. And you have to ask, what do people care most about? It's their pocketbook and their health. So we have to put plant health in that context in order to win some of these arguments.
Anything else from online? Great. So we're going to have about a half an hour break. So we'll meet back at 10:25, I believe, and we'll start again we have 2 more talks before lunch. So we'll be on break for the next half an hour.